The castle had no windows, only towering stone walls that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Time did not exist here. Only the cold flicker of candlelight and the ever-present hum of something unseen pressing against Valliere's mind. The pendant pulsed at her throat, a silent master she could not disobey. It guided her steps through the winding halls, past doors locked with iron sigils and tapestries that whispered when no one was near. She had lost count of how many nights had passed, if they were nights at all. She wasn't a prisoner, not in chains or behind bars. But every time she tried to turn back, her body refused. Every time she reached for a door, her hand faltered. The pendant's will was stronger than her own. Tonight, however, was different. As she passed an arched doorway, she heard it. Soft voices, urgent and afraid. She pressed herself against the stone, listening. She should not be here. It is too late. He has already claimed her. Then we must act before she learns the truth. The air in the corridor turned ice cold. Valliere's heart pounded. They were talking about her. She clenched her fists, fighting against the pendant's control. If there was a way out, she would find it. But first, she had to learn why they feared her, and why the vampire lord had truly brought her here. Valliere's pulse pounded in her ears as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall. The voices were close, too close. She steadied her breathing, forcing herself to stay silent. The pendant did not resist her hesitation, as if it too was listening. The figures moved beyond the doorway, their cloaks brushing against the marble floor. She caught a glimpse of them in the dim candlelight. Two figures, both robed in deep crimson, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. They moved swiftly, their whispers fading as they disappeared down the corridor. Valliere hesitated only for a moment before slipping after them. She moved carefully, keeping to the edges of the hall where the torches burned low. The castle was a labyrinth of endless corridors and towering archways, but the pendant's hold on her had taught her something valuable. If she wanted to be led, it would guide her. But now she resisted, and it remained silent. Step by step, she followed. The robed figures descended a spiral staircase, their voices barely above a whisper. If she finds out, she won't. He keeps her close, but not close enough to the truth. It is not his truth we should fear, it is hers. Valliere's breath caught in her throat. My truth? A heavy iron door groaned open ahead of her, followed by the hiss of burning torches. The figures stepped inside, and before the door could fully close, Valliere slipped through, pressing herself into the shadows. The chamber beyond was nothing like the grand halls of the castle. It was ancient, lined with towering bookshelves and stone altars, their surfaces covered in runes that pulsed with dim crimson light. The air smelled of parchment, melted wax, and something darker, something old. And then, at the center of the room, she saw it. A massive open book lay on an altar, its pages shifting as if touched by an unseen hand. Symbols carved into the stone pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. And there, drawn across the page in ink so dark it seemed to drink the candlelight, was her name. Valliere stepped closer, her breath coming faster. The pendant burned against her throat as if warning her. It has begun, one of the figures murmured. And then, they turned. Their hoods fell away, revealing faces twisted with shock and fear. She knows. Valliere didn't wait. The moment their eyes met hers, wide with shock, then sharp with realization, she turned and ran. The pendant flared hot against her skin, fighting her, dragging at her limbs as if trying to keep her in place. Not now, she willed, clenching her jaw. She forced her legs to move, pushing past the unnatural weight that tried to hold her down. Behind her, the figures shouted. A sudden rush of wind howled through the chamber, extinguishing half the torches in a single breath. Shadows lengthened, twisting unnaturally, and the stone beneath her feet trembled. Stop her! Valliere lunged for the door, shoving it open with all her strength. It groaned in protest, but she squeezed through, slamming it shut behind her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her feet pounded against the cold marble floor as she sprinted up the spiral staircase. The air around her thickened, the weight of unseen magic pressing down on her chest. The castle itself seemed to resist her escape, its hallways stretching, twisting. Was she running the right way? Or had the path changed? A deep, echoing boom rang through the halls. A door had been flung open somewhere below. Find her! Valliere forced herself to move faster, her breath ragged. She had to think. She had to find safety, but where? The pendant pulsed again. this time not in resistance but in guidance. It pulled her to the left, a door. She didn't trust it, but she had no choice. With a final burst of speed, she threw herself inside, shutting the door just as the distant footsteps grew closer. The chamber beyond was silent, dark. Then, from the shadows, a voice, low, familiar, and filled with something unreadable. "You should not be here, Valliere." She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. The vampire lord stood before her, waiting. Valliere didn't speak. She barely breathed. The vampire lord stood before her, tall and motionless, his presence pressing against the air itself. His crimson gaze flickered over her face, her trembling hands, the pendant still glowing at her throat. The silence stretched between them, thick as mist. Then, he moved. Not a step, not a shift of weight, but a change in the very air. One moment he was across the room. The next he was close enough that she could see the sharpness of his features, the way the candlelight caught the faintest gleam of his fangs. His gaze darkened. "You ran." It wasn't a question, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something almost curious. Valliere swallowed hard but still said nothing. The vampire watched her for a moment longer, then lifted a gloved hand. Slowly, deliberately, he reached toward her. The pendant flared with heat. Valliere flinched, but he didn't touch her. His fingers hovered just above the cursed thing, his expression unreadable. "You resist it?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. A pause. Then something almost amused flickered across his face. He exhaled, the faintest trace of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good." Before Valliere could react, he stepped back, the moment shattered. "If you wish to survive this castle, Valliere, you must learn when to run and when to listen." His gaze sharpened. "Tell me, what did you hear?" Valliere took a slow breath. The air was heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous. But she would not run this time. She straightened her shoulders, pushing past the lingering fear, past the weight of the pendant trying to hold her back. It wanted her silent, obedient. But something deep within her, something hers, fought against it. She met the vampire lord's gaze. "They said I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "That you've claimed me, but that it's not you they fear." The words settled between them like a blade drawn in warning. For the first time, the vampire's expression wavered. It was slight, just a flicker of something in his crimson eyes. Calculation, amusement, concern, she couldn't tell. Then he let out a soft, quiet chuckle. "And yet here you are, speaking when you should be afraid." Valliere's fists clenched. She was afraid, but fear would not silence her anymore. "What do they mean?" she pressed. "Why do they fear me?" The amusement faded from his expression. A quiet tension filled the room. Then slowly he took a step closer, towering over her. "Because, Valliere," he murmured, tilting his head slightly, "you are not what they think you are." He lifted a hand, and with a single motion, the pendant at her throat shattered. The magic binding her fell away like chains undone, and in its absence, she felt it. Something inside her, something waking up. The moment the pendant shattered, Valliere staggered back, clutching her throat. A strange sensation rushed through her like fire and ice colliding, like a veil being ripped away. It wasn't pain. It wasn't relief. It was power. Her breath hitched. The castle walls no longer felt like they were closing in on her. The invisible weight pressing down on her mind had vanished, and beneath it all, something stirred deep within, something she had never known was there. She lifted her gaze to the vampire lord. He was watching her closely, his crimson eyes flickering in the dim candlelight. "What did you do to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Not from fear, but from something else entirely. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her as if waiting for something. Then at last he spoke. "I did nothing." Valliere's pulse quickened. "That magic, that pendant, the control you fought, it was never meant to protect you." He took a slow step closer. "It was meant to keep you contained." The room seemed to darken. "Why?" she demanded, voice stronger now. "Why was I brought here? What am I?" For the first time, the vampire's expression turned truly serious. "You are not a prisoner, Valliere. You never were." He paused, his gaze locked onto hers. "You are the reason they fear this castle, and the reason I cannot let you leave." Her heart pounded. "Why?" His lips parted as if to answer, but then the doors slammed open behind her. The robed figures had found her. And they were no longer whispering, they were chanting. The air turned heavy, thick with rising magic. The stone floor cracked beneath her feet. Something was coming. Something that had been waiting for this moment. And deep inside her, something answered back. Valliere's instincts screamed at her to move, to fight. The chanting filled the chamber, deep and echoing, weaving power into the air like a storm waiting to break. The symbols carved into the stone pulsed violently, their glow searing into her vision. The robed figures stood in formation, their hands raised, their voices rising faster, sharper. Then it happened. A shockwave of raw magic erupted from the floor, splitting the stone beneath her feet. Valliere gasped as the force sent her staggering back, her body tingling with unfamiliar energy. A howling wind rushed through the room, carrying with it a voice, a whisper, a scream, a presence. Cold fingers wrapped around her mind. Mine. A darkness surged through her veins, crawling beneath her skin like something alive. She fought to hold on to herself, but it was like standing against a tidal wave. Her limbs locked, her breath caught, then, all at once, she wasn't alone inside her own body. Her vision blurred, twisting. The edges of her sight darkened. She could feel something looking through her eyes, something ancient and hungry. The chanting figures stepped forward, their voices triumphant. She is ready. No, Valliere clenched her teeth, fighting, pushing back against the presence clawing at her soul. She wasn't theirs. She wasn't. The vampire lord moved. In an instant, he was there. His voice a sharp command that shattered through the magic like a blade. Enough! A wave of his power crashed into the room, sending the robed figures flying backward. The symbols on the floor flickered and died. The wind vanished, and the presence inside her, the spirit, the thing that had tried to claim her, shrieking in rage, was ripped away. Valliere collapsed, her body trembling. But before she could hit the cold stone, strong arms caught her. She looked up into crimson eyes. The vampire lord held her close, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the robed figures scrambled to their feet, their spells broken, their voices filled with fury, but he did not look at them. Leave, he commanded. A gust of unseen force slammed into them, and before Valliere's dazed mind could process what was happening, they were gone. Banished, vanished, erased. Silence fell over the chamber. She shivered, her body weak from the struggle. But her mind was clear. What was that? She whispered, barely able to speak. The vampire's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he finally answered, his voice low and steady. A warning.